So let me welcome all of you to the Data and Power panel of Inframarginalism and Internet. I'm Ramsey Woodcock, assistant professor here at the Rosenberg College of Law. And we've got a great set of panelists here to talk about data and power. The way I'm going to structure this is each of the panelists is going to give a presentation of 7 to 9 minutes in length. And I will enforce the time limitation strictly. So keep an eye out in the chat. That's where I'll call time, 2 minutes left, 1 minute left, and so on. And then once we've heard from each of the presenters, I will provide some comments on the presentations. That will last for about half an hour or so. And then we'd very much love to have questions from the chat. So to those of you in the audience, it's a bit frustrating not to be able to have you all on screen, because then it would be a more personal experience. But in lieu of that, I hope that you'll make full use of the chat. If you see on the right side of your screen, there's a session tab. You want to use the session chat, not the event chat. So use the session tab, go to chat, and then feel free to put your comments or questions in the chat as we go along. And I don't need to make the structure too strict. So if you're presenting and you see a question you want to answer, or please feel free to just remain in conversation with our audience throughout. It's also fine to try to mix that up. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to turn the floor over to Dan Greenwood, who's going to talk to us a little bit about self-colonization in personal information. So
Ramsey, before I start, and before I even thank you, I thought I had figured this out before, but now I don't see the button for slides. I don't see how I can do it without the slides, but it'd be better if I can get my slides out.
Yes, so you should see a list of icons, a set of icons at the bottom of your screen. One is a video, one is a microphone.
Yes.
One should be a little monitor icon with a red slash through it.
Yes.
If you click on that, it should allow you to share your screen.
Okay, let's see. So, did that work? Yes. Okay. Great. All right. So. Oh, now I've got the echo again. What do I do about that? All right.
Make sure mute the other tab, and you should be fine.
I don't have another tab. All right. Maybe it was somebody else. Okay. So first of all, Ramsey, thanks for inviting me and for that terrific introduction. And I really I have a very simple-minded point. That I think is a little bit different from the more complicated perspective that Ramsey and Michael set out. They focused on the surplus triangle, and I'm going to talk a little bit about a different form of surplus and a different form of rent seeking that I think also gives us some more freedom to escape from the ideological structure here. So let's see if, okay. So here's our basic supply and demand curve, the way that you learn it in the introductory economics course. And the key is that at equilibrium, this is a picture from equilibrium, right? Price equals cost at the margin. And the triangle that Ramsey and Michael were talking about is due to the fact that costs may be below that price, not at the margin. And I don't mean to, I think that's enormously important, but I'm actually going to talk about something else. So first thing to notice, though, is the attractiveness of this picture and why it has lasted for now close to a century in the introductory course. It creates some really nice results from an ideological perspective. First of all, it means that if price is equal to marginal cost, then at the margin, producers aren't making any profit. If profit exists at all, it's a temporary reward for market disruption. And so you don't, for example, need to even think about the 19th century critiques along the lines of surplus value. It means that customers must pay for any increase in taxes. That's another part of the tax debate that wasn't emphasized in the first session. They have to pay for unionization, they have to pay for wages and regulation, because each of those increases increase costs, and the costs have to be passed on in the form of price. So in terms of coalition building, it means that consumers and employees, who you might think are the same people, are instead in opposition to each other. It means that managerial pay is necessarily earned, since if a company were to try and pass along costs that weren't mandatory, it would be driven out of business. And conversely, it means that low employee pay also must be earned. Invidious discrimination, for example, is impossible. Again, the company should be paying as much as it can, but not a cent more. And finally, it means that history is bunk. This model doesn't have any history in it. So if, to the extent that the model is correct, we don't need to think about the primitive accumulation of capital. We don't need to think about privilege. We don't need to think about path dependence. We don't need to think about historical discrimination or colonization. None of those matter. All right? So I want to actually talk about some less obvious corollaries that also, it seemed to me, follow from the original model, automatically and quite simply. One is this: if there's no surplus, then the stock market doesn't exist. More precisely, it requires a situation other than the one portrayed here. And the reason for this is quite simple. Any firm that pays dividends has higher costs than one that doesn't. Dividends aren't legally required, and so competition is inevitably going to force any firm that wishes to stay in business to reduce its price to cost. That's the original graph. And if it does that, it doesn't have any money left over to pay dividends. Now, if dividends are not going to be paid except in disequilibrium, then it's perfectly reasonable for rational investors to conclude that giving money to a firm now in the hope of dividends later is a fool's errand. It's the now where you might get a dividend, but you're actually sending the money in the reverse direction. So the stock market ought to collapse. Second, it means that mass production either doesn't exist or automatically leads to monopoly. In any mass production industry, the curve is a little different from this. Marginal cost declines with quantity instead of increasing. And so the supply curve has the same shape as the demand curve. The lowest cost producer is the largest one, and vice versa. It can base its price on its competitor's cost and charge more than its cost, extract a surplus, and invest that surplus to increase its quantity, decrease its costs, and increase its lead. And so everybody fails except for the largest and the first. Again, this is a 19th century or at least early 20th century understanding. It goes back as long as marginal cost analysis itself. I'm not pretending to anything innovative here. The third one is that long-term investment in general is irrational, absent an expectation of monopoly. Startup costs, building a railroad, building a factory, a power plant, designing a computer program, writing a book, investigating an article, as Ramsey was talking about earlier, designing a new antibiotic. These earn no return. The return comes from your marginal sale. Your marginal sale and your marginal cost is the cost of delivering one more package or one more widget or one more copy of the program and the article. And typically that's going to be close to zero in a modern economy. And so your marginal cost is almost certainly going to be below average cost. If you see this in advance, the only rational thing to do is not to play the game at all. Don't compete. And I would argue that in a modern economy, this is going to be the standard characteristic. The graph is actually quite exceptional. Usually marginal cost should be lower than average cost, and the model therefore predicts failure of one sort or another. Okay, well, so we see despite this, right, we see a stock market, we see mass production, we see investment, and in every other advanced countries than ours, we even see passenger railroads. So something is missing in the model, And I think normally what it is some form of pricing power, often due to patent monopoly, network effects, bundling, subsidy lock-in. There are all sorts of reasons why you might get some pricing power. But the point is to see that pricing power, that is situations where price does not equal marginal cost, is not exceptional but the norm. And so therefore the division of the surplus is central, not peripheral. There's always going to be a surplus. It's surplus that allows the entire system to function. Now, Ramsey asked us to talk about the internet, and so I want to say this. The internet, it seems to me, changed everything and nothing. It's the same process that we've had since the beginning of the modern economy, but it intensifies the prior both economic and even more political economic trends that we've seen. Network effects mean that consumers naturally want to use the largest network or the largest marketplace and the most compatible technology. That's old, but they're now even bigger than they used to be, and even more central and even easier. So if you gravitate to the largest marketplace, the largest social forum, and the most compatible technology, you end up using, as almost all of us do, Amazon, Google, Facebook, Word, and even Zoom, because there is a certain advantage to having your speakers know how to use it instead of trying to fake it in the middle of their talk, as we're doing here. If everybody's using this a particular platform, then the producers and the advertisers have to follow. And that means that, again, the largest network can charge above cost, generating a surplus, which it can then use to increase its quality and its size and reinforce the network effect yet again. And also, and not incidentally at all, it can use those funds to lobby for law that will protect, and enhance this upward redistribution cycle. And that's the political point. And I do think that for people who are trying to escape the narrowness of the Chicago school, one key part of early 20th century economics that we have really lost is understanding how critical the politics are and is, how important it is to think about the law. Okay, so what's to be done? I have a few minutes. Let me talk about what's to be done. A very small suggestion. It isn't meant to be central. It's at the margin, and that is property rights in personal information. So the current law is that you have no property. My slide is wrong. You have no property in your own information about your shopping patterns, movements, or expressed opinions. The person who has the property is the one who gathers it, who surveys you, who aggregates it, who holds the information, who uses it, manipulates it, sells it. So Google knows and can sell your information. You neither you have no right to withhold it except by things that are not practical, and you don't even have actually a right to know what it is once it's been aggregated. And this, it seems to me, is susceptible to a kind of classic liberal complaint. Property in the liberal analysis is important because it creates a space for freedom, a place where we are not subject to the whims of the powerful, and where we are independent. Locke's argument defending property started with ownership of your body, and therefore what you mix your labor with. And we've used this in all sorts of, oh, I see, my time is up. All right, Ramsey, I'm gonna just finish by saying this. Here's the proposal: a royalty every time a company uses your information for profit. It seems to me that very simply it will move the costs, move the property, change the incentives, and have a whole slew of corollary and one-off effects that we can discuss further in the discussion. Thanks a lot.
Thanks very much, Dan. And I should have introduced you properly at the beginning of your presentation. So Dan Greenwood is professor at Hofstra and author of of my very favorite articles in corporate law. What's the name of that article, Dan?
I don't know which one is your favorite.
So thank you very much for that. So now we're going to move to Martina Ferracani. Have I pronounced it correctly? And Martina is Max Weber Fellow at the European University Institute. I like that name, Max Weber Fellow. Martina is going to be talking about the relationship between privacy restrictions and trade. So we've got 9 minutes. Martina, please take it away.
Thank you, Ramsey, and thanks for giving me the opportunity to share my research, and greetings everybody from Florence. So let me share my screen. Okay, I hope, can you see it? With the open, I'm not, I'm never sure. You can see, right? Because I can't see you. Okay, yes. Great, thank you. My presentation is about a chapter of a book I'm writing on cross-border data flows. And this chapter is looking at regulation of personal data and how we can assess regulation of personal data from a trade policy perspective. So what I'm going to do is to quickly present different data models which are appearing globally on the regulation of personal data, then introduce a trade perspective and present quickly an application of this perspective for the GDPR, which is the data regulation in Europe. So regarding data models, what we are seeing in the last decades is the development of three clear models of and approaches to regulate data globally. One approach is a kind of open approach on transferring of personal data cross-border. This is a typical approach that the US will have, in which data can be moved cross-border pretty easily, and there is self-certification, ex-post accountability, but basically there is no restriction whatsoever on the transfer of personal data. Another approach is the European approach, or regulatory safeguards, in which data can only transfer cross-border if there are certain conditions which are fulfilled either by the country with a certain adequate regime, or by the companies by having some kind of specific clauses or binding corporate rules, or by having the consent of the data subject. And then there is the controlled transfer model, which is a model used, for example, in China, in which there is a strict conditions for transfer data abroad, in some cases even a ban to transfer the data, or in other cases just the authorization of the government to be able to transfer this data. I've recently written a paper with my colleague Erin van der Melle. It's going to be published soon by the World Bank, in which we look at 116 countries globally, and what we try to categorize different models used. And what we see is that the open transfers model is pretty common. There are 39 economies out of 116 which have this open transfer, so virtually no restrictions on the movement of personal data cross-border. The regulatory safeguards model, the one used by the EU, is by far the most used. Globally, there are about 60% of the countries having this model, while the controlled transfer model is pretty rare, and we found only 10 economies out of 116 having this controlled model. And just to be a bit more clear about what the regulatory safeguards and the controlled transfer model are, the typical example of a regulatory safeguards model is the GDPR, the data protection law of the EU, in which data can be transferred cross-border only if there is adequacy of the country to which the data is being transferred, also just for processing, or if there are appropriate safeguards, so the use of specific binding corporate rules or standard contract clauses, or derogations. Mainly the most important one is the consent of the data subject. While regarding the controlled transfer, a typical example is the Russian personal data law, which requires data operators to store and process and keep basically all data of personal data of Russian citizens within the territory of Russia. and only a copy of the data can be transferred cross-border. So taking this as a first differentiation of different approaches on how to regulate cross-border transfer of personal data, I want to just give an introduction, a perspective on how these kind of rules can be discussed and interpreted with the trade lens. The main institution regulating trade is the WTO. The WTO is basically virtually regulating all trade. 98% of trade is regulated by the WTO with 164 countries, and it covers both goods and services. And the main pillars of the WTO discipline are three. The MFN treatment, which basically means that a member has to give to all members of the WTO the same treatment. There cannot be discrimination between different members. The national treatment, which means that a member cannot discriminate foreign providers versus the domestic provider, and the market access, in which the member commits to open up specific sectors based on a specific list of commitments. The agreement of interest for data flows is the GATS, the General Agreement on Trading Services. Also in the GATS, there is never a specific mention on digital trade or data flows, mainly because it was written and committed to in 1994. So it was too early to commit on digital trade. But there are three cases, US gambling, China division, and China electronic payments, which in which the dispute settlement body basically claimed that the commitments taken on let's say, traditional sectors also apply online to digital trade. So if we assume that the restrictions on data flows also restrict the digital services, then we can say that the regulation of personal data can have an impact on the commitments that countries have taken to liberalize trade under the WTO. So under the WTO, there are commitments to keep trade open and make services happen across borders, but there are also certain ways in which the countries can deviate from their commitments. And in order to deviate and restrict services trade, such a measure has to be necessary for important non-economic objectives, such as, for example, privacy. And this measure has to be at least trade restrictive. So having this as a framework, the question of my paper is what will happen if we try to assess data protection laws under the WTO lens? And this is what I do in the paper. Is something which is not completely unreasonable, because there's been also claims by the former US Secretary of Commerce that the EU data privacy laws create barriers to trade. And so if we try to apply this framework to the GDPR, what I find in the paper is that we can see that parts of the GDPR can create a problem under WTO. They can represent a most favored nation violation or a market access violation. In terms of the most favored nation violation, just quickly, what I want to say is that the way in which adequacy decisions are given, and adequacy decisions are really important because basically allow data to transfer cross-border without any limits, any requirements. These decisions are very political in practice. There's an echo. Sorry. So they are very political in practice, and actually the European Commission doesn't hide it. It's written in the requirements to provide adequacy. So this makes wonder whether there is the same treatment applied to all countries. And I'm almost done, just 1 minute. And regarding the market access violation, what the way in which the transfer of data is restricted with the specific safeguards is usually considered pretty expensive by companies. There are some studies showing that this kind of restrictions are pretty expensive, even up to several millions of dollars for big companies. And we also did a study that showed that this kind of restrictions can have an impact on services. So considering that these personal data protection laws can have a restrictive impact on trade, then the question is, are these measures necessary, and the way in which they are defined necessary and least trade restrictive ways of achieving privacy. So the whole paper is virtually about this, and I still am working on finalizing the analysis, but the most important question I ask is privacy really better legally protected and technically more better ensured with these conditions, or will there be alternative ways of ensuring privacy while having less negative impact on trade? And just to conclude, I think this is something which goes well beyond trade. The trade framework is just a way of analyzing privacy laws, but this fragmentation that we see is something which has a stronger impact beyond trade and goes into the freedom of using the internet and freedom of expression. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Martina. There's a lot out here. So our next presenter is Sam Weinstein, who's a professor at Cardozo Law.
Hey, thanks, Ramsey. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you.
I've been having a little technical difficulties. I got booted off before, so I apologize in advance if that happens. I don't know if we're having a terrible winter storm. Maybe that's part of the problem. But thanks so much for organizing this.
Yeah.
What's that?
Sure. If all of the other panels hit the leave button for the duration of Sam's speech. If you hit that leave button, you'll come off the video, but you'll still be here in the session, and that may reduce the burden on the system.
Okay, Ramsey, should I go ahead?
Yeah, go ahead, Sam.
Okay.
And if the rest of us hit leave, back on later, that might be.
Okay. Thanks so much. Okay, thanks for organizing this, Ramsey. This is great. So I'm excited to present a paper today that I've co-written with Alexander McKay at the Harvard Business School. It's the first time either of us are presenting this, so it's still in a formative stage, so we're excited to get comments. It's about pricing algorithms. So just quickly, what are pricing algorithms? Well, it's code that automatically applies a computerized rule to set prices based on some inputs, right? Which could include supply and demand conditions, rivals prices, customer preferences, when you're making the ticket purchase, right? Seasonality. And one key fact about these algorithms that we are concerned about is that they vary in sophistication, right? So some are quite advanced, some are less advanced. And I'll say why that's important in a second. But so there's been a fair amount of scholarly commentary on the risks that pricing algorithms pose around collusion, right? Both explicit and tacit. And I'd say that's where, at least in the competition space, that's where we see most of, if not all of the scholarship, right? And there has been, on the explicit collusion side, some DOJ enforcement, and many of you probably know about this case from 2015, an enforcement action against some companies that were selling posters on the Amazon marketplace, and we're using algorithms to fix the prices of those posters. One question you might have about pricing algorithms and explicit collusion is, can they collude even if they're not programmed to do so? So there's some interesting ideas around explicit collusion. For tacit collusion, right, the idea here is that the speed of algorithms, the amount of data they can take into account, will make tacit collusion easier. And there's some good scholarship about that. But this paper takes a different tack. So it's building on work that Alex, my co-author, did with his co-author, Zach Brown, at the University of Michigan. And this is work in economics showing that pricing algorithms might result in super competitive pricing even in the absence of collusion. So here's the theory in a nutshell, right? Variations in sophistication of these algorithms will lead to asymmetries in pricing frequency and the ability to account for rivals' prices. And these asymmetries will soften competition among rivals. So just take a simple example with 3 firms, each of which have pricing algorithms of different sophistication. Firm A has the best, firm B has the second best, firm C has the worst. Firm A can change its prices all the time, right, multiple times a day. Firm B can change its prices twice a week, say on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Firm C can only change its prices once a week on Sundays. So what's going to happen in this market? Well, firm C knows that it's going to get undercut. Its prices will be undercut by the faster algorithms, right? So what's it going to do? It's going to raise its price above the super competitive level in a differentiated products market, try to make up its loss of share with some with higher margins. Firm B is going to underprice firm C, still price above the competitive level. It's going to know it's going to lose some share to firm A, but it's going to try to make up for that with some higher margins again. And firm A, with the fastest algorithm, is going to undercut both firm B and firm C, but still price above the competitive level. scoop up share and still get some higher profit margins. And there's some empirical evidence that this is actually happening out in the market. Alex, my co-author, has done a study of the over-the-counter allergy medicine market showing that this seems to be going on in the real world. Okay, so one key point about this is not collusion in the classic sense, right? So if you look at this market from the outside, you'd see that firms are competing and charging different prices. It's not a punishment scheme. Okay, so non-collusive or competitive algorithmic pricing leading to super competitive pricing is the setup. How much should we care about this? Well, we think a lot, right? So pricing algorithms are increasingly common. Obviously, Uber and Lyft are ones you've heard of and probably used. The airlines have for a long time priced with pricing algorithms. But the most important, probably for our purposes, is e-commerce, right? Pricing algorithms are penetrating e-commerce, to a greater and greater extent. This is partially because companies have their own pricing algorithms, but also because you can buy them off the shelf. So if you're selling on Amazon, for instance, and you're a third-party seller, you're probably using, or you might be using, an off-the-shelf algorithm, right? So we're seeing a real spread in algorithmic pricing. So we have a strong concern here about a significant transfer of wealth from buyers to sellers. So what do we do about it? Well, if we think about other remedies that have been posed for pricing algorithms regarding collusion, they're not really relevant here, right? So where collusion is explicit, we'd expect Sherman Act Section 1 liability to attach if you can find the colluders, right? If you can uncover the cartel. Tacit collusion, more difficult case, right? It's not currently unlawful under the antitrust laws. And we've had scholars propose some market-based solutions, expanding the definition or getting rid of the agreement requirement, right? Expanding antitrust to capture tacit collusion or direct regulation. What we're talking about here doesn't lend itself to antitrust at all, right? There are no agreements. It's really a competitive market, just all the companies are charging above the competitive price. So we have to think about some other solution. And we think here about, in the paper, about regulation. And what regulation, right? That's the question. So what we do in the paper is to look back at an earlier period where there was a revolution in pricing technology. So this is the 1920s, showing that this is not a unique event, what's going on right now. So in the 20s, the revolution in pricing technology was the creation of price card holders and price tags, right? So for the first time, if you entered a store, you could see all the prices displayed, you can comparison shop, right? And store owners, sellers, came up with new technologies or new strategies like bundled pricing, like loss leaders to take advantage of these technologies. And what you get in the 20s is the deflation that leads to the Great Depression, right? And part of this is the new technology, part of this is the new pricing strategies. And during the Great Depression, the government responds with the NIRA, right? National Industrial Recovery Association, right? Administration, I'm sorry, which allows industries to set price floors and to limit discounting. Okay, we probably, or many of us probably agree that was a bad idea, right? But that's what they did. So you have massive government response to this revolution in pricing technology. So we've seen this happen before. Government has responded to changes in pricing algorithms to disruptive markets. So what about this market and pricing algorithms right now? Well, the problem is different than in the Great Depression, right? We're not worried about deflation anymore, we're worried about inflation. And the mechanisms for super competitive pricing I mentioned above suggest the solution that we propose, right? So the mechanism for asymmetric pricing frequency and asymmetric pricing based on the ability to incorporate other rivals' prices, right? So you could target regulation either at when firms price or how they price. So let's start with the when. So one thing you could do is regulation that can require firms to price at the same time every day or every week, right? But everyone's pricing at the same time. So this approach has been tried in the retail gasoline markets in Austria and Western Australia. It's been proposed in the high-frequency trading market, so to change the trading market from a continuous market to one with batch auctions that happen very quickly, right? But they break up the market, so everyone's pricing at the same time. Right, in our setting, it would reduce the significance of asymmetric pricing frequency, right? So we would require in these markets subject to this problem, everyone price at the same time on the same day, right? Now we don't worry so much about variations in algorithmic speed and we're not going to have that leader-follower situation. The downside, a couple of potential downsides, one, reducing firms' ability to react nimbly to changing market conditions and an increased possibility of collusion, right? If you're pricing at the same time every day and the prices are public, you worry about collusion. So that's option one, regulating when you price. Option two is regulating how you price, right? So barring firms from using rivals' prices as inputs in the algorithms. So again, this would eliminate the asymmetries that lead to the super competitive pricing we're talking about, this super competitive pricing in the absence of collusion, but it has potentially major drawbacks, right? Might reduce price competition, right? Because the algorithms are no longer taking price into account, although the firms could, the humans could. On top of that, you need a giant new bureaucracy probably to investigate the content of algorithms and to make sure that the algorithms are not taking prices into account, right? So it's very invasive, right, and requires a lot of work. So in the paper, we argue for, based on what we know, regulating when firms price, right? Less intrusive, potentially equally effective, right? And then we close the paper by saying, this should be a lesson for our view of innovation policies, antitrust lawyers, those of us who are antitrust lawyers, right? So antitrust just assumes innovation is good, right? It's sort of unalloyed good, doesn't interrogate what the innovation is. We're arguing this is an anti-consumer innovation, right? It's certainly an innovation, helps the sellers, right? It's faster, has more data, but it harms consumers, right? And the lesson here is, if we look at the broader world of regulation, right, you can regulate this out of existence like you could with any other harmful innovation, like, say, flavored e-cigarettes. So that's kind of where we close the paper, and I'll stop there.
Great, thank you, Sam. We are moving from property data, which data can be used to exploit. But both of these ideas are predicated on this notion that we've had a huge reduction in the cost of communication that makes it possible for the data to flow. But isn't a reduction in costs a good thing? I'm going to let Brian talk a little bit about the consequences of being able to communicate freely. Professor Brian Fry is my colleague here at the University of Kentucky Rosenberg College of Law. Go ahead, Brian.
Thanks, Ramsey. So, thank you, everyone, for tolerating my presence at this conference, and many apologies for the tardiness of the essay that I contributed to this conversation. If you didn't have a chance to look at it, I will obviously understand, given that it wasn't available until very recently. In any case, the paper that I want to talk about, or the essay that I want to talk about, essentially consists of a kind of theoretical observation and a modest proposal. So, as it were, the observation relates to the concept of public goods, which obviously I spend a lot of time thinking about as an intellectual property scholar. We generally think about this subject matter of intellectual property as being information goods, which are sort of paradigmatic public goods, goods which are non-rival, and in the absence of regulation, non-excludable as well. And so the kind of the study of intellectual property is the study of how do we think about the best way of maximizing the production of these public goods, which I like to think of as kind of a perpetual utility machine, right? In other words, the idea behind a public good is once it exists, it provides infinite opportunities for consumption. And so as long as it's being consumed, it's just pumping out utility for people to enjoy until they stop being interested in that particular good and move on to another one. So the observation is really, the theoretical observation is really that we sort of take for granted that public goods are necessarily something that we want to encourage, and that if a small amount of public goods is a good thing, then a whole lot of public goods is an even better thing. But it's really all about the consequences of consumption, right? We think that if people want to consume it, then it must be a good thing, and the more consumption, the better. But it's not necessarily, it doesn't necessarily follow from the fact that a good is non-rival that it necessarily generates utility when the good is consumed. I mean, after all, we have at least the concept of something like a demerit good, right? Where the consumption of the good actually makes people worse off rather than better off, and therefore we might be concerned about consumption of the good in question. And if demerit goods are bad, well then public goods that are demerit goods are way worse, right? Because I mean, you know, if it's bad to smoke cigarettes, it's even worse if you can have as many fucking cigarettes as you want, right? So what happens if we have a public good that actually decreases utility rather than increasing utility when it's consumed? So in the paper, I reflect on 3, I think, representative examples, I guess, of what I would refer to as toxic public goods. In other words, goods that are non-rival and, practically speaking, non-excludable, which nonetheless, at least potentially, might decrease welfare when they're consumed. Specifically, internet trolling, pornography, and ideology, right? So a trifecta here. Everything terrible comes in 3s. And all 3 of those things, at least theoretically, make people worse off, even though they're technically speaking public goods. I mean, after all, trolling, pornography, and ideology all satisfy the criteria for being a public good, insofar as they're non-rival goods that people seem delighted to consume in large quantities, and actually seem to, at least in the moment, take pleasure from even the consumption of, even though in the long term it might be detrimental to their welfare, and certainly the consumption of those goods might offload harms onto third parties, right? So even though the people consuming an internet troll, for example, might find the consumption of the troll pleasurable, the person who's the target of the troll typically finds it less pleasurable than the consumers. Likewise, people consuming ideology presumably find the consumption rewarding, even though it might offload harms onto society. So the modest proposal in the paper is essentially that we should recognize that public goods can sometimes be toxic, even though technically they satisfy the relevant criteria, and that if we want to maximize the efficiency of the production of public goods, we ought to think about how to maximize the efficiency of the production of toxic public goods as well. In other words, what is the optimal level of production of trolling, porn, and ideology, and how, from a policy perspective, do we ensure that we have just enough?
Thank you, Brian. Since you haven't used all of your time, I'm going to use moderator's privilege to ask you a quick question over the next 3 minutes. And that is, in what sense is trolling non-rivalrous and non-excludable?
From the consumer's perspective, the producer of trolling is creating an experience, as it were, right? So why do people go on Twitter? I mean, in large part, because they take pleasure in consuming the pain of others. You know, I mean, Twitter, in many respects, is all about that experience of seeing somebody else get owned or canceled. And so the trolling is a good in the sense that an infinite number of people can consume and take pleasure from somebody else's pain. And they seem to, right? I mean, Twitter sells, right? There's a lot of people who spend a lot of time and seem to derive considerable utility from seeing other people get owned on the internet. And like, you know, who am I to judge, right? I mean, if people take pleasure from that, then good on them, right? We should encourage people to get utility wherever they can find it. The question is ultimately, you know, how do we make it more efficient, right? So maybe we need to redistribute. And the end of the paper kind of peters off a little bit. I know. I figured no one reads to the end anyway, so it doesn't really matter. But, you know, I mean, lots of different ways of thinking about the problem, right? I mean, after all, maybe we could like redistribute some of the welfare gains that people achieve from trolling. Maybe we, you know, if we think about it in a Pigovian sense, right? Maybe like non-economic markets can be the subject of Pigovian taxation as well. I mean, after all, it doesn't seem conceptually difficult to tax people's pleasure. You know, I mean, I had, you know, thinking like, if we think about pornography, if you think pornography is bad for people, there's lots of ways of remedying the situation. Maybe we, you know, like before you can click through on Pornhub, you got to like say Hail Mary or something like that. Right? I mean, like there's lots of ways of,
a regulatory solution. Well, thank you, Brian. So last but not least, we have Thibaut Schrepel, who is a professor in business school at Utrecht. Is that right, Thibaut?
The law school.
Law school
at business school. So.
Okay, at the law school at Utrecht, and he's going to be. So we've been talking so far about you know, ways in which data has sort of gotten out of control and what we can do about it. And Thibaut talked to us about one way in which the information age reasserts control. So Thibaut, why don't you take it away?
Sure. So, I mean, first of all, I know it's going to be tough to follow this presentation by Brian, but I'm going to try my best. I also wanted to say that I'm very happy to be sharing such a great panel and very happy to be invited by you, Ramsey. So in those, you know, ages where everyone is depressed, I thought that I would be mentioning, and thank you publicly for that. Can you see my screen right now that I'm sharing? Yes? Okay, perfect. So there are two things that I want to discuss. I mean, they are interrelated. And Ramsey asked me to talk about blockchain and how potentially it could help in the way by which we share values. So what I thought would be necessary is for me to explain the importance of architectures, and especially when it comes to digital architectures, and then to move on to the upper levels of the blockchain architecture and show you a few examples of where indeed the technology could be used to share value a bit differently. I'm not a tech solutionist. I do not think that blockchain will solve all of the issues, but hopefully I will convince you that there are some ways that we should consider as lawyers. So, okay, share my screen over here. So it seems clear that different architecture equals different distribution of wealth. And if that is true, then blockchain means a specific distribution of wealth. But for me to explain which one we may see in the future, or at least for part of the economy, I need to explain very briefly what a blockchain is, and especially when it comes to wealth and the creation of it. And for that, I need to make a distinction between two separate things. The first is the design of a blockchain, and I'm going to try not to be too technical. And the second one is the governance, so namely the people who are interacting on the blockchain. When it comes to the design, there are different types of blockchain, and now it's very sexy and trendy to say that blockchain does not exist because it doesn't mean anything, because you have to be more specific. So if someone is just, as I'm doing, telling you about blockchain without being more specific, the person is most likely discussing a public permissionless blockchain. A good example of that is the Bitcoin, right? Anyone can see the information on the Bitcoin blockchain, something that I will explain, and anyone can actually buy Bitcoin and start using it. I will not be discussing private and permission blockchain, but maybe if we have time for questions. Still, for the design, this is, in my opinion, very important. All of the little red dots are transactions. So it could be that I sent a Bitcoin to Brian, that Ramsey sent me a Bitcoin, and back and forth. It could be smart contract, anything you want. Every time you have a certain number of transactions being proposed to the blockchain, a block will be created, and that block will be hashed, which is the encryption of the block, and the hash is the identity of the block. What happens, and hence the word blockchain, a chain of blocks, is that when you have 10 more transactions here in that blockchain, for instance, you're going to be recording those 10 transactions, but the trick is that you will put the hash of the previous block, so the identity of the previous block, into the next one. And that way you create a chain of block. And why is it important? It's important for that reason, and you may have seen this graphic on the internet, but I think it's a nice way for me to explain the design of a blockchain. A blockchain is decentralized and distributed. The distribution relates to the location, where is the data, and the decentralization relates to the control, who is in charge of the data. And on the blockchain, it's decentralized and distributed because the data is everywhere. So if you want to download a copy of the entire Bitcoin transaction history on your computer, you could do that. And there is no control, or put differently, everyone is in control, but no one can actually choose to take your Bitcoin away from your wallet. So that's the design. And then comes the governance. So who are the people on top, and who are the people, making sure that indeed blockchain is decentralized and distributed? And for that, I just wanted to mention something, which is that in the 90s, and it appears very clearly if you read the work of the cypherpunks and the first cyber law scholars, they thought, or at least some of them thought, that internet would be a way to escape the rule of law because it will be possible to hide behind a computer. Now, as we know, it's far from being true. It's probably even the opposite. So the idea for blockchain has been actually different. And the idea is to get rid of control. Because if you do not control, then how can we apply the law to you? But it also means that if you do not control, potentially you lose the power of doing something which we think is bad in the field of antitrust. So that, I just wanted to show you that. I know there are too much information on that, but the only thing that I wanted to mention is that, so there is no control. Of course, that's the theory. In practice, you see some forms of control, and you have three categories of participants for each blockchain: the core developers, users, and miners. I do not want to be too technical, but the only thing that I want to mention is that, sure, some of them control a little bit what's happening, but there is no power of command and control. So blockchain is very much different from a firm where the CEO or the shareholder may actually impose something on you. So that's for the infrastructure. And now I come to the topic of the wealth distribution, and hopefully I will explain why the infrastructure is so important. And there are two things that I want to mention here in the 3 minutes that I have left. The first is the idea of leveraging power. So to be sure, I'm not arguing that there is no concentration within blockchain. And indeed, you may argue that some mining pools, they come together to be mining the blockchain, and they will capture part of the value this way. Only part of it, right? We've seen those days that the value of Bitcoin is going up. And if you had Bitcoin in your wallet, well, actually, you're going to be a rich man, right? So, but still, they capture part of what's happening in the architecture of the blockchain. But remember, no power of command and control, meaning that there is no intermediary, right? They cannot actually prevent you from doing something, which means that everything that you build on top of it cannot actually be abused by the people running the layer one. And that is very important. If you compare that to a centralized company, Apple, Facebook, and Amazon, they can provide you with an infrastructure, and then say, well, I've decided that you cannot sell stuff on my store anymore. You cannot put the application that you want in my app store, and so on. For a blockchain, it's not possible. So it means that it frees the layer 2, which are all of the applications that you can plug on top of the architecture that I've been explaining. This is something that we explored in a paper. I'll give you the reference, but that's pretty much, in my view, the idea of antitrust, which is to free economic transaction, and the same is true for blockchain. And in the 1 or 2 minutes that I've left, I want to give you some concrete example of why this is important. And this relates to the idea of scarcity, something being rare, although the thing is digital. And now I'm being distracted by Brian, beautiful cat, different story. So here's an example. On the blockchain, since all of the little real red dots are being encrypted, and anyone can actually download a copy of those little red dots, it means that if I sell you something, this is public information. So if I then try to sell the same thing to another person, I cannot do it because the transaction has been recorded and everyone can see that I sold you the thing in question. So here are some examples of why this is important. This is a CryptoKitty. You may have heard about that. The value of this one is actually almost $400,000. It has been sold for this price. And why is it important? Because if you are to raise the CryptoKitty, whatever it means, you can sell it, and no one at the architecture level can prevent you from doing that. Here's another example. You may know the heart of Mondrian, and this is now on a blockchain. And so if you want, you can buy, for instance, this piece of art and then sell it. And again, no leveraging power, so no one can prevent you from doing that. The last example that I want to show you, and I put the reference here, it's a book that has been written and put on the internet a month ago. And what the author has been doing is to actually sell part of the book. And he made almost, which sure isn't much, but if you know the publication process, it's still a lot of money, €1,000, selling part of the book, meaning that now someone can actually own this paragraph over here and sell it to another person. And so this is true for basically everything that is being developed on top of a blockchain, no leveraging power, and that potentially may change the value. And I guess for me, the question is, if at some point you have the alternative with using a social media or search engine with no possibility of creating some value for yourself, or doing the same and on top of that being able to sell it eventually, because what you do is that you tokenize the thing. The question is, which one would you use? And it seems to me that the answer is pretty clear. Of course, I know people are waiting for the killer app. I think that's a mistake. Blockchain will evolve following a Darwinian process. So it will be no killer app, but small progressions. But eventually, if we reach that point, it will be a tough question for the tech giants. And it's going to be hard for them to compete, since if they try to provide something similar, they lose the power that they love so much. So this is what I wanted to tell you, and time's up. Just I wanted to mention this website where you can find all of my scholarship open access, and look forward to the discussion. And again, Ramzi, thank you very much for this beautiful conference.
Thank you, Thibault. So now I'd like to invite our panelists who are not on screen to hit the share video and audio button so that we can get you on screen. Those of you in the audience, some of you may have seen this button or clicked on it. So we're just going to have the panelists on video and audio at the moment, because we are limited to nine video feeds total. Unfortunately, but please encourage you to comment and ask questions in the chat, and we'll be reviewing the chat at the end of this session and trying to answer those questions and comments. So we do want you to feel absolutely included in the panel discussion here. So I'm going to kick off the questioning here with just providing a sort of overview of what I think is going on in all of these great works of scholarship. And what we've got here is the problem of abundance, right? We've got very low cost communication, and so it opens up this world in which you can collect data very easily on those who are doing business with you. You can also share or dynamically update your prices, or prices is a unit of data in a sense, and you can it allows you to update your prices and change them very quickly, and that is one way in which the low cost of data makes exploitation possible. But at the same time, it's another channel is through advertising and manipulation. So why do firms generate all this data on us? It's to be able to sort of find us as consumers and sell to us and extract more rents from us, effectively extract more surplus from us. And that leads to the question of what to do about this low cost of communication. And of course, to bring in Brian's point, and also the low cost of communication itself leads to speech that we might consider toxic to society generally. And so it's interesting to see what this conundrum of superabundance has caused. So, for example, to hear Dan Greenwood arguing for a property regime, those who are not familiar with Dan's work may not fully appreciate the significance of this moment. one of the most trenchant critics of the property concept that's out there. But one grasps in the face of a sort of toxic superabundance, one grasps at things that one would not normally find interesting. But at the same time, Martina is raising this incredible, if what we're doing is we're pursuing, perhaps not propertization of data, but privacy, that means that we now bring back all of the problems associated with property and protection and so on, that perhaps we thought we left behind when we got to a zero price for communications. And so now we have to consider, what does it mean, for example, when the European Union negotiates a special exemptions essentially to its privacy regulations for the United States, but not for other countries, that may provide even more protection for privacy than the United States, as the United States doesn't provide much. Now we're in the world, in a kind of mercantilist world in which, some nations get favored treatment and can trade and others cannot. And so behind all of this, we now have Thibault saying, well, here we have blockchain. So what does blockchain do? It's a way of creating constraint. It's creating constraint out of the sort of low-cost information free-for-all that the internet would otherwise be. And so we have to wonder, are we just coming full circle? First, we knocked down the cost of communication by creating the internet, and now we work hard to sort of build it back up by creating these sort of blockchain-type architectures in which things are being cabined and data is being trussed up in these according to these mechanisms. So that's sort of I think the overview of what I see going on here. And the question I'd like to put to you all is, so is the data revolution a mistake? Should we, why don't we just get rid of the internet? Why don't we get rid of all of this low-cost communication to begin with? We've gotten so much good out of it that it's worth all this trouble to try to recreate the world of constraint on top of this platform. There's economists, Robert Gordon, who's argued, fairly convincingly that the benefits we've gotten from the information revolution are not all that impressive relative to the ones we've gotten more generally from the Industrial Revolution. So is it worth it?
Can I try to answer?
Are we just running in a big circle? Oh,
please go ahead, whoever.
I got Thibault. I saw you first,
okay.
So why don't you go ahead?
So no, I mean, I wanted to answer in a provocative way. It might be a great question, but I think it's not as if, one day a group of persons decided, oh, let's do the internet and that's going to be the way, right? This is something that emerged. The same is true for capitalism, by the way. When we discuss, oh, is capitalism a mistake? Maybe it's a mistake, but in a way, it's an emerging thing. And so the question is, of course, what do we do? But I do not think that it's an issue that we can solve just a few of us and just a number, because, of course, we talk about data and I understand that we've seen an increase. But last year, we produced all over the world 47 zettabytes of data, whatever it means. In 2030, it will be over 2,000. So the data is going to increase exponentially. And again,
there are historical examples in which we've stopped capitalism, aren't there?
Sure, but what I mean is that it's not going to be possible to stop that or to stop this revolution. If that's revolution, just, we could create some zones where there is no internet or no capitalism, but overall, this is a choice by society, and I do not believe that this is a choice imposed top down. So if we want to find a solution, it has to be bottom-up solution, and blockchain is a good example. And again, it's only part of the solution, but this is just what I wanted to mention here.
So you got me thinking. So this is an interesting model because it's it's the information age as a sort of natural, an evolutionary process, and then the question is, because two kinds of things can evolve, right? Good things and afflictions. And the question is this an evolved affliction or an evolved improvement? I'm going to go now to Dan, who I think I saw next.
Got my mic on. So I want to make a couple of short points. So first of all, the cheap data problem is a problem that has been with capitalist markets since at least the Industrial Revolution. So this is another aspect of it's all the same, even though it's completely different. We've been producing too much stuff, and we need to control it from time to time. So, that's not just stuff for the landfill. It's also the people who call me 17 times a day offering to resell me my Social Security information or whatever it is, whatever the current scam is. But there's also the problem that I addressed, which is all of these parts of the economy work only because the marginal cost graph doesn't work. These are all instances in which the marginal cost is zero or close to it, and the average cost is quite a bit higher. And so your question about do we need to or are we going to? We're going to inevitably build a way of avoiding that, or it won't exist. So the fact that the internet exists means that there's another pricing mechanism going on that's not fitting the model. And in this particular case, it's advertising funding and selling of information. So part of the point I was trying to suggest by putting a price on the information is simply that if it's less profitable to sell my data, then producers will have to find another way to fund themselves or go out of business. And some of them, I think some of the ones that Brian is worried about, will go out of business. Others will have to find another income stream that hopefully will fit the positive aspects of markets a little bit better. I don't think there's any reason to think that just because this is an emerging bottom-up phenomenon that it's good. So is cholera.
I'd like to encourage all of us to consider the possibility that we're all really just masochists and that we love the pain. And if we do, then why not maximize it?
Yeah. Any other thoughts?
Well, just quickly on my side, well, I never thought about these issues from the perspective I'm seeing, but just a comment about the what also Thibaut was saying about the irreversibility of the internet revolution. I think it's not a question to think about how whether this could change and it was wrong or right. It's just is. But I think there is nothing inevitable on the way in which the internet and the digital economy is evolving. And now there is a big role also for us as researchers and for policymakers to decide how this will evolve and give guidance on or at least help to minimize the negative aspects. And just an anecdotal thing, I'm Sicilian, from Sicily, one of the poorest regions of Italy and one of the poorest regions of Europe. And if it wasn't for the internet, I would still probably be there. So I think, it opens up so many opportunities. So I'm rather optimistic about this revolution. It's just a matter of regulating it properly.
The benefits exceed the cost. Thibaut, did you want to add something?
Yeah, just very briefly. I was not suggesting that because it is emergent, there is nothing we can do or we should not think about it, right? That's the reason why we are all scholars and we are trying to come up with solution. But I think what I wanted to say is that it would be great if we can actually implement our solution in a way which is more bottom-up than trying to fix that with a DMA or the DSA or whatever. And the only thing that I wanted to mention, and it might be an answer to Brian's question, when I read Darwin, I was amazed to learn that there has never been any example of any species which has evolved against its own interests. So it might evolve in a way to hurt other species.
Squad goals, Thibaut, squad goals.
Well, yeah. So I'm not sure if that's if that's a bad evolution overall. But again, it doesn't. I'm not here to suggest that. Therefore, we should not try to fix the issues at all. So I just wanted to put that.
Dan, was there something that you wanted to add just now?
I think I'm going to let other people.
Okay. Well, so moving on here a little bit, I was interested in the fact that out of our selection of policy responses, or you have this idea of propertization of data, and then in Thibault's work, you have this idea of a kind of technological fix in which you build constraint into the technological system itself. And that's how you solve your problems. And that's what blockchain offers us. But interestingly, I didn't see, I'm not hearing sort of what we would call classic regulatory solution. So, one of the harms we might say that data creates is the ability of those who use it, right, firms that use it to manipulate us through advertising, right, through promotions. So one wonders whether, why isn't the regulatory solution here simply to ban advertising? Then we can, because having data about each other certainly is going to be socially, beneficial in many ways, as long as it's not turned toward sort of manipulating us into purchasing things that we don't want. So why is that not on the table as just a kind of basic no-brainer regulatory fix? We don't have to recreate the property system with all of its strange all the problems we know so well in it. All we have to do is to get rid of the major way in which data is used against us. We don't need blockchain for that either, do we?
But Ramsey, what if we like being manipulated?
Or here's another way of asking Brian's question. The idea that you would eliminate all advertising basically brings the economy to its knees. And I'm not quite as much of a masochist as Brian is, so I actually like being able to buy stuff. And I like being able to do things. And without advertising, I don't see how I would be really capable of functioning as a consumer or a participant or a producer. So that doesn't seem like a very useful proposal to me. What I might go to, though, if you were looking for regulatory proposals, is this: we've put the basic decision-making process about the structure of the internet and the uses of the internet into the hands of a handful of corporations and even smaller handful of wealthy individuals who happen to have lucked out in prior iterations of the internet and the economy as a whole, and therefore control firms and wealth. And they're not answerable to anybody but themselves, and in particular not to us. And to, maybe this is the point that Thibault was trying to make, is that the structure matters, and the structure is not being done bottom up or top down. It's being done corporate down by corporations that we've created and then allowed to govern us. That was the self-colonization part of my title. And it does seem to me that, again, since I'm on this sort of 18th century property kick at the moment, we could take the 18th century property notion of property in yourself another step to say, it means we ought to have a vote. And so maybe the regulatory response is to say, Google should not be allowed to determine its search algorithm that belongs in a governmental institution that is answerable to the Democratic majority. That the surplus that is generated by natural networks should not be permitted. That every medieval town knew that you do not allow an individual owner for the annual fair or the marketplace, because that person is going to take all the money and leave nothing for anybody else. What you need to do, the first thing you do as a municipality, is you seize the fair from the noble and give it to the population. Maybe we need to do that here and say Amazon simply has is not in a business that is appropriate for private ownership.
It is, something that you touch on there, Dan, I think is very important, which is the sort of natural asymmetry in the ability to exploit data that we've been seeing. The individual, really just, despite, some potentially having access to as much data as they want, really the ability to sort of concentrate it and exploit it in the way that that larger institutions do. And so that seems to have upset a kind of balance in power. And that is very much created, I think, a lot of good justification for having government intervention in order to reestablish that balance. Martina, I think, was next in wanted to comment.
I just wanted to add a point on this rebalancing and regulatory efforts to make rebalancing between the user and the platform. And actually, at the EU level, we just have now such a proposal, which is pretty advanced, is the Digital Services Act. And in this, some things regarding advertising, some of the proposals are, first of all, transparency, algorithmic transparency, or now a person is targeted by a certain ad. There is an opt-out option for the consumer to opt out from profiled advertising, which is very interesting and empowers fully the consumer to use a platform without being profiled, which will have a huge impact if that actually comes through to the final text of the proposal. There is a lot of political advertising. So there is this effort, and this effort started with the GDPR, the data protection law, in which the consumers were empowered to have more control on their data. And on what Daniel was saying about also the property of the data, I think the GDPR attempts to go in that direction, and already there is the power of consumer to delete data. This is actually there from 1995. So there is this kind of control, but still is very limited because there is still a lot of uncertainty on how the data is actually treated. But I think the EU is doing an extra effort to try to regulate. It will not be the best regulation because we don't know enough, but I think it's worth trying and seeing what comes out of it and then adjusting eventually.
If I may, I'll confess that I'm a democracy skeptic. After all, the premise of democracy is that it's good because P is greater than 0.5. But I observe that the modal voter is a hateful idiot. So the premise seems mistaken to me.
I take that personally, Brian.
You're not the modal voter, Ramsey, unfortunately. So I would propose that maybe we have reached the delightful circumstance where we can substitute democracy for something better, namely Facebook.
You heard it here, folks. So, I'd like to, leave 10 minutes or so for questions from the audience. But before I do that, I just want to bring in a little bit of Sam's paper into the discussion, because what Sam and his co-authors show is that if you've got sort of algorithmic pricing, you have the dynamics of competition change to sort of naturally raise prices above competitive levels. So it turns out that that sort of data-rich algorithmic competition without any collusion naturally tends to raise prices and therefore to redistribute surplus from buyers to sellers. And so we have, even if we were to deal with, say, the problem of advertising regulation, and we were to propertize data, the mere fact of sort of data-rich pricing, algorithmic pricing itself, is going to continue to drive redistribution of wealth. And so, so it may be that all of the different we've been talking about won't be enough to deal with this problem. So let's go to some of the questions in the chat. The first one I'm seeing here is Frank. This is a question for Sam. Frank says, setting the moment for released or some other basis for regulating may be reasonable, but how do you sort algorithms that should be regulated? I think you assume that all algorithms compete on capturing surplus. so all should be regulated. So Sam, I'll let
Yeah, it's a great question. So, I mean, it could be very difficult to figure out which markets where, you know, are subject to this problem, right? I mean, you start to assume at some point that most e-commerce markets have algorithmic pricing going on. Not all of them, you know, may not always work out this way. You know, we think it most likely will work out this way in most markets, but may not always, right? So one thing you could do is try to pick and choose. I think in the end, though, I think as your question suggests, Frank, most markets that have algorithmic pricing are going to go this way. We're going to start seeing super competitive pricing. So you would eventually have to, at least theoretically, regulate all of them.
Ramsey, may I react?
Great.
Well,
yes, go
I
ahead.
can hear the echo. Okay. No, I just wanted to say, I mean, to your point, right, for algorithm and creating collusion, Justice Brandeis said that collusion between small companies was fine, right? So everything should be okay, isn't it? So, I mean, that's one point. I'm surprised that, of course, I disagree with that, but that we haven't heard in the discussion from some people that collusion between companies is okay using algorithm. But in any way, I'm sure this will be coming. There is at some point in the chat, and I think it's an excellent comment made by Grégoire. He said that basically, and I very much agree, the data that is being sold by the big tech companies is not, you know, our place of birth and this kind of stuff. It's the use we made out of the platform or the aggregator. So in a sense, they generate the data thanks to the fact that we are using the data. It's not something that we bring and that will be easy to regulate. I'm not saying it's impossible, but in my view, that's an important point. And the last piece that I wanted to mention, because I understand that it's a bit of a provocative panels. So to answer your question, Ramsey, in a provocative way, why are we not talking about just regulation? Well, potentially, yes, it's true. We haven't been talking about just regulation, and it might be good news, actually, because what we see with the Facebook versus Australia case from yesterday is that when you try to regulate the big tech in the old-fashioned way, which is we impose the law, well, potentially you see that it's hard to regulate the code. Again, I'm not saying this is great, that Facebook is right or wrong, but I'm just saying that potentially we may want to create a sort of cooperation between the law and the code. So try to see how infrastructure may help and not just regulation taken by a few people. So again, ties to Brian's points on democracy, I guess, but I just wanted to put that on the table.
Yeah, and I think this is, your point is with this idea that we have one of the interesting things that sort of the internet allows us to do is to kind of create an architecture, a rigidity in social relations at a technological, where when we could only sort of manipulate physical objects and they couldn't constrain our social interactions in quite such a fine way. So that's a very interesting thought.
Yeah.
So
and
moving on. Yeah.
No, I just wanted to say something. When the internet appears, if you go back to the archive of the New York Times and the Washington Post, people saw that it would change the speed by which we exchange information. We knew that internet equal information. What we didn't see at the time is that it would change the nature of information. And today, a Zoom or Hopin conference is a good example. And it seems to me that with blockchain, we are anticipating, in a sense, the fact that it will change the speed by which we transact. I heard that some companies in the US pay their employee every 12 seconds. I'm not sure this is helpful, but why not? But it will also change the nature, and that's something where lawyers have a role to play, in my view. So again, very much agree with what you just said.
Great. I just want to continue. Thank you, Thibaut. I want to just continue with the questions in the chat, make sure that that we're getting to all of them. So here I see Grégoire's question has been addressed. Faisal here says, on banning advertising, that might be one way of framing the matter, although is it a way that will inherently incline us toward answering in the negative? But it does bring up the larger tried but true question of the possibly corrosive effects of relentlessly pushing forward new forms of commodification. Why is the endless commodification of everything good? But this is an interesting question, right? Because what you've heard on this panel is a desire to return in some sense to commodification in order to deal with a problem of this sort of, freely accessible superabundance. So commodification, is perhaps more like a tool for addressing the distribution of surpluses and perhaps not an issue in itself. Seth says to Brian, that's the populist vision of democracy, but the liberal Hamiltonian vision is just democracy as another check on power. Brian, I'll let you respond to that.
Yeah. I mean, but I think we have to recognize that democracy is just a means to an end, not an end in itself, and we can do better.
Great. So moving on, I see Thomas says, adding to Martina's point, matchworking data subjects exercise their right to data erasure. So Martina, care to engage in such an imagining for us?
Well, that would be interesting and will actually show the impact that the laws that are being implemented can have on platforms. I find it very unlikely, but definitely it's interesting also the fact that a lot of countries are picking up the EU approach. And what I showed, the map I showed that 60% of countries that were analyzed, but a lot of countries worldwide have the European approach and the European way of regulating data. So these countries also have the right of erasure of all the data by the data subject. So that's an interesting point.
Thank you. So I see follow-ups. I see another from Faisal. I also see one from Frank. And since he's following up on an earlier question, I'll let him go first. So Frank says, follow-up, if consumers can see what others have paid, it likely will be harder for firms to capture inframarginal rents. Can mandatory price disclosure solve the problem? So just to clarify for audiences, Sam, has been made some arguments about how we can deal with this problem of competition naturally driving algorithmic competition naturally driving prices up. And one of the ways to do that that Sam suggested was through disclosure. And so Frank is saying if consumers can see what others have paid, it likely will be harder for firms to capture inframarginal rents. Can mandatory price disclosure solve the problem?
That's just a great question. So I have to think this through a little bit, and I see some other interesting points that Dan made in the chat, which I also have to think through. But I don't, at least the problem I'm talking about, I'm not sure it can, because if you're, just based on the theory that we're working with, all the firms in the market are charging more than above the competitive price. So even if you can see that, you don't really have any options, right? And the other issue here is you may not even recognize, it's unlike the collusive price where everyone's charging the same price. You may not even recognize that you're charging above the competitive price, right? That you're paying more. So I'm not sure disclosure solves the problem as directly as either regulating when they price or whether they can take into account other firms' prices. But I have to think about it. So it's a really excellent point.
Okay, so we're just about at time. So I want to thank all of our panelists for these excellent presentations and for the excellent discussion. I'd like to invite our audience, of course, the most important thing with online conferences is not to get tired. So we've got, nice big 45-minute breaks between panels. So we're going to reconvene at 2:15 Eastern time, US Eastern time here. But if you're not too tired and you'd like to mingle or socialize, you can head over to the networking function and get randomly chat roulette matched with other conference participants and continue the discussion over there. So thank you to everyone and to our excellent audience for a very stimulating discussion. We'll see you back here.
Thanks, Ramsey. Thanks all.